So welcome everyone. It's really great to have you here today. And as is our practice, I wanted to begin the meeting by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney meets. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations country. And we want to pay respects to elders present, past and emerging, and acknowledge the ties to land and culture that they still have. And it's really wonderful to host you here today. I'm excited for the event that follows. I'm going to keep introductions short today because I feel like we have lots to get through. So usually we give a little introduction to the network, but I thought we'd just pass that over today for the sake of saving time. And I'll also keep the introductions to our distinguished speakers relatively short, again, just to preserve the precious time for discussing what is a really rich book and what will promise to be I think, a great discussion. But let me begin by telling you a little bit for the format today. We're going to have about 10 minutes of hearing from Ramsey, give a bit of a synopsis of the book and its themes and its purposes. Then we're going to hear from Sam Haddad, who will speak for about 15 minutes, giving some general comments about specifically the 3 chapters that were circulated prior to the event. And following that, we'll hear from Anne Rogerson, who speaks for about 15 minutes. I believe she's going to be particularly speaking to chapter 2 and the text discussion there. We'll give Ramsey a chance to respond briefly to Anne and Sam. And then on about the 11 o'clock hour mark, or for us, 11 o'clock, about the hour mark, we'll open it up to broader discussion and questions. If you could hold your questions, this is to the general audience, if you could hold your questions until that point, that would be great. But from then, you can use the chat function to indicate that you have a question to ask. You can either signal that with a Q, and I'll call you at the right time, or you can type your question and I'll give you the chance to read it, or I'll read it for you if internet, video, audio, anything fails. We have that as a backup. So let me begin just now with an introduction of our book author. So Ramsey McGlazer is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Ramsey also received his PhD in Comparative Literature at Berkeley before holding a postdoc fellowship at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University, followed by a lectureship at the University of St Andrews, and then recently has had his homecoming to Berkeley. So as anyone who has delved into the book today, Old Schools, will have seen, Ramsey's work spans 20th century European and Latin American literature, film and critical theory. Within Italian, English, Spanish and Portuguese language works, Ramsey is especially interested in poetry and poetics, politics and aesthetics, feminist, queer and psychoanalytic theory, if that's not enough to whet your appetite. It's wonderful to host Ramsey today for a discussion of his book, which won the American Association for Italian Studies Award for a first book. Congratulations, Ramsey. Old Schools pursues many fascinating lines of inquiry that together make for very stimulating meditation on what education is and is for, set within the context of debates about modernism, progress, social transformation, aesthetics, and politics. But on a personal level, for anyone who's learned another language, and especially a classical language, I think it generates some reflection on the political implications of what can appear to be a very private and intimate labour, conjugating verbs and declining nouns endlessly. For me, it provided some much needed social validation for what sometimes felt like and feels like a pure, if not somewhat perverse, indulgence. So thanks, Ramsey, for making time to be with us today, and please, everyone, join me in welcoming Ramsey.
Thanks very much. Just to make sure you can hear me fine, I take it. Testing, yes, okay. Excellent. So this is less a synopsis, this set of introductory remarks, than maybe a set of sometimes self-lacerating reflections. but I want first to thank you all for being here, and especially I want to thank Tristan and Ben for organizing the event, and the two respondents for their willingness to share thoughts today. It's funny, it occurred to me that if the two respondents, a classicist and a philosopher, didn't exist and weren't in the virtual audience, my superego would have had to invent them. In all seriousness, though, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be discussing my book with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, which I'm sure I will learn a lot from. I didn't share my chapter on Pier Paolo Pasolini with you because I thought, and Tristan agreed, that the chapter on Glauber Rocha might speak more directly to your collective interests. But I'd like to begin by referring to a moment in my chapter on Pasolini, chapter 4, where I turn to a short essay by Pasolini called the Abiura dalla Trilogia della Vita, the abjuration or repudiation of the trilogy of life. In the essay published in 1975 to accompany the release of his film Salò, Pasolini takes distance from, to the point of purporting to take back his own previous work. He writes that the three films that he has made just before Salò were animated by a belief that he can no longer sustain, a belief in the promise of bodies and pleasures, in the progressive struggle for sexual liberation, that's his phrase. In my chapter, I read this short text dialectically in order to show how Salò continues the work that Pasolini claims in his Abiura he's discontinuing, so that pleasure, if not quite progressive struggle, persists in the film from which it's supposed to have been banished or expelled like a bad student. I begin with this detour today because preparing my introductory remarks for you all was a task that renewed my appreciation for this essay, the Abiura. Although it's an honor to be given this assignment, the task of preparing my remarks more specifically put me in touch with the desire to repudiate what I've just written. The book was published in January 2020, and already I find myself a changed person in a changed world, wanting to take it back, or perhaps just to say to you all, please wait for the next one, it will be better. Wanting to promise that in Pasolini's words, it will be more legible. I'm going to resist the temptation in what follows to recant, apologize, excuse, and explain. But I do want to note at the outset that though newly published, the book already feels in some ways like ancient history. Speaking of which, you will have gathered that the book is not, in fact, about ancient history, but rather about the uses and abuses of that history, about modern fantasies and projections related to ancient Rome, and about accounts of its affordances, of Rome's affordances, some of the unspent potentials that were seen to reside in Rome by a range of cultural vanguards active in the late 19th and 20th centuries. I chose the two chapters that I shared with you today because of how clearly they center on these fantasies, projections, affordances, and potentials, and also because of how they center on Rome. In chapter 2, Giovanni Pascali, writing in Latin, thinks of the classical past not just as a repository of tools for teaching, but as a site of possibilities that remain alive and, in his words, give greater life to thought, end quote, even in their deadness. It's not just, in other words, that ancient Rome hands down a language and tradition that are useful for instructors in Pascali's present. He makes a stronger claim in his educational writings about the status of dead languages, and we should note the plural, where Latin is just one of these languages. It also happens to be, the language in which in poems like Pedagogium, he laboriously writes Pascali. I argue in the chapter that Pascali's engagement with Latin and the fantasies that he spins out about ancient Rome should be rigorously distinguished, therefore, from two tendencies in which they might at first seem to participate or that they might seem to anticipate. First, and most emphatically, the fascist regime's efforts to assimilate, the Italian fascist regime's efforts to assimilate ancient Rome and modern Italy, to make them identical or render them the same, And second, the rightist modernist classicism that in my introduction and elsewhere in the book, I associate with T.S. Eliot, for whom I quote, "The Roman Empire and the Latin language were not any empire in any language, but an empire and a language with a unique destiny in relation to ourselves," end quote. Now, I do not go so far as to argue that for Pascali, Latin is just any language. To argue that would obviously be absurd, but I am interested in the moments in his writings where, as when he refers to Sanskrit, say, or when he's suggesting that written Italian, modern Italian, is also dead, we can see something like this generalizing possibility, right? This divestment from the fantasy of specialness or singularity attaching to Latin and to Rome. These moments are important because, again, they let us distinguish Pascali's handling of Latin from the conservative or later fascist insistence on the unique richness, the specialness and singularity of Latin and of Rome. So what does instruction in Latin offer for Pascali, if not a way of coming into our inheritance, in Eliot's phrase? Far from holding a flattering mirror up to students in which they're meant to recognize themselves, it offers a set of arduous rituals and a source of resistance. It is pedagogically useful, not only for students in brick and mortar schools, but for Pascali's readers who are sent back to school by his poems, because Latin enforces a slowing down, makes these readers stop to think, and estranges them from the vernacular, from the forward march of proto-fascist progress, and indeed from the new nation, the Italian nation. I used to joke, given that Pascali's Latin poems are, as we now say, very niche, even for scholars of modern Italian poetry, that this chapter represented my bid for relevance. The joke was an inside one, indeed. It was at my own expense as well as Pascali's, because throughout old schools, I seek to question relevance as a self-evident value, unqualified good, and current common sense in education. What if it's irrelevance, the ostentatious irrelevance of the dead language, as opposed to the obvious relevance of the living, that in fact best activates students' desires? What's lost when we devalue formative frustration in education or the democratizing potentials of difficulty? These questions recur throughout the book, which culminates in my reading of Brazilian director Glauber Rocha's 1975 film Clado, made in Rome during Rocha's exile under Brazil's last civico-military dictatorship. Here in the film, it's no longer Latin as such that's at issue. Clado is not filmed in Latin, as is Derek Jarman's Sebastiane, for example, released a year later. But the film, which we might at first take to be just another off-the-cuff avant-garde experiment, emerges in my reading as a meditation on questions that are close to Pascali's, despite the decades worth of distance between these two figures working in disparate mediums. So Glauber is still asking, in other words, how certain uses of deadness can enliven thought, and how ritual, rote performances and mechanical chores can be set to work counter-hegemonically. That last formulation may sound vague and general, maybe even ritual, but in Clado, I want to say counter-hegemonic means something quite specific. It means anti-imperial and anti-authoritarian. So I read Clado as a film that's about the setting to work of schooling to these ends, to anti-imperial and anti-authoritarian ends. This reading leads me to develop a critique of Paulo Freire's pedagogical philosophy, as in some ways too focused on relevance. My critique also happens to run counter to some strands in decolonial thought, and I'd be happy to elaborate on these moments in the chapter if people are interested during our discussion. For now, I'd like to close with a brief extract from a book called Marx's Literary Style by the Venezuelan philosopher Ludovico Silva. It's a book that I didn't know about when I was writing Old Schools, but Silva's pages on classical education, his phrase, echo Gramsci's pages on the Latin class. These are at the center of my introduction. And they can help us, I think, bring together Pascali and Rocha across the distance that separates them. So I'm quoting from the forthcoming translation by Paco Brito Nunez. There's a PowerPoint presentation in the chat that should be available to all of you. It's nothing special, but does have a slide with this block quotation. There is at present a tendency to deprecate the much vaunted classical education. There's an objective reason behind this tendency. For centuries, classical education has served as the metropolitan tip of the spear of a Western culture, which through beautiful filigrees hides monstrosities such as racism, colonialism, and imperialism. That culture was the clever and brilliant invention of capitalism. Capitalism was born thinking of itself as eternal and thinks of itself that way more than ever. In order to sustain the sense of self, it needed a culture that, despite being historical and concrete, it is after all just a small fraction of world history, conceived of itself and announces itself as eternal, as culture par excellence. Anyone who studied a dead language extensively, I imagine this moment might speak to many of us, the way Mark studied Greek, for example, has a better understanding of the secrets of living tongues. To strive to give theoretical life to a long dead tongue through the act of translation has a creative impact on our living language, especially our mother tongue. It gives us a sense of wonder about its life in the mouths of living humans, a wonder that stretches voluptuously like breath itself, that it bursts from the hedge of his teeth and exhibits before us its syntactical articulations like a living, breathing organism, free from academic and grammatical sclerosis, lively and triumphant like an animal. The microscopic scrutiny of a dead language allows us to find the luminous logical skeleton beneath the opulence of a living tongue. A stunning passage in my view. So to come to my conclusion, as my chapter on Pascali is at pains to show, he was emphatically not free from academic and grammatical sclerosis. And to be sure, there's something pointedly sclerotic about Claudio Rocha's film as well. Still, Silva's language is apt in my view because Pascali works to give greater life to thought, in Silva's terms, to activate our wonder by assigning exercises in a dead language. For his part, Rocha suggests that the way to confront a culture that masquerades as capital C culture as such is not to pretend to bypass, but to tarry with it, to return to and reckon with, to learn to parry its blows, which is also a way of getting back in touch with what Silva calls its contingency and concreteness. The film's voiceovers become so many lectures that we're asked to sit through, not so that we'll pay undivided attention, but so that in our very spacing out, we might come to recognize capacities that we didn't know we had, including capacities for collective rebellion. Thanks for sitting through this lecture too, and for your kind, if not undivided attention.
You're muted, Tristan.
Thank you. Thanks for the heads up. I'm going to hand it over to Sam in a minute. Let me introduce him for the uninitiated. Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University, Sam works on continental philosophy with a particular interest in 20th century and contemporary French philosophy, democratic theory, and philosophies of education. His published books include Derrida and the Inheritance of Democracy, which was published in 2013 by Indiana University Press, and an edited collection together with Olivia Custer and Penny Deutscher, Foucault, Derrida, 50 Years Later, published by Columbia University Press in 2016. It's great to have Sam here as someone who has wonderful expertise in education in particular. So please join me in welcoming him today.
Great. Thanks so much, Tristan and Ben, for the invitation. And thanks above all to Ramsey for writing the book. And just to check, is the sound okay? There's no weird echoes or things? Okay, one never knows. This is a great book, and I was actually wanting to read it ever since I read about it through Fordham University Press, and then it was published. And I never had the time to read it because I never have time. So I was very, very happy to be asked to read it for this event. And what I want to do in these remarks is I'm going to just put the spotlight on some of the ideas and concepts that I think are kind of driving the argument of the book. And I'll make some comments about them, but I'm going to pose a lot of questions, which is very unfair to Ramsey because he'll have no time to respond to them. But it's just a way of putting some things on the table, and also really a way of giving testimony to the richness of the book. Reading it, I really enjoyed it. I learned an awful lot, and it just set my mind off in terms of question after question, and not critical questions, just sort of questions of wonder. So I'll just move through some different ideas. The first idea I wanted to speak about is the idea of school, and sort of the simple but complicated, simple question to ask, probably hard to answer, is just to ask how are we to understand school in the title. And now the title's plural, so maybe we should have more than one understanding of school at work in the book. And just to say a little bit about this, I mean, the progressive pedagogies that Ramsey opposes in the book all seem pretty uniformly opposed to school themselves. School is usually seen in progressive education and progressive philosophies of education as a kind of disciplining and restrictive thing. It's often seen as much as a verb as a noun, and it's a bad verb to be schooled in this way. And I think when Ramsey speaks of school in his old school, sometimes he's taking on that definition of school, but wanting to reevaluate it. But I think other times there are other ideas of school floating around as well. And I just wanted to mention one idea of school, which is not necessarily at work in Ramsey's book, but it might be, and actually some remarks he just made make me think maybe it is there actually more stronger than I thought. It's the idea from Jan Maschalin and Martin Simons, and Ramsey mentions them in a footnote in the introduction, and in other philosophers of education who are doing similar kind of work, like Walter Cohen and Jason Wozniak. What Maschalin and Simons do is they return school to the Greek notion of schole, and many people do this, and it's understood as a space and time of leisure or of free time. And they really highlight the fact that school and this space-time is cut off from the world of work and production. And this, I think, actually has a lot to do with what Ramsey just said about irrelevance. So what's important in school is that students come together to study something, and we suspend the relation of that thing to the outside world in a very artificial way. And now, I mean, this has its roots. The idea of schole is an aristocratic notion, but people like Maschalin and Simons are trying to take it away from that aristocratic, the dominant aristocratic flavor of it, and reimagine it democratically. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about that. I just wanted to put it there, and really just to reiterate the question for Ramsey, first of several questions: what kind of schools are implied in the old schools of the title? And if he wants to say a little bit more about that. The second idea, or kind of pair of ideas I wanted to bring up, is the ideas of collectivities and time. That's something I was really struck in reading this book, is the way that collectivity emerged in different ways in the methods being promoted. And this links to schole as well, because it's that idea of students coming together. So it happens in Ramsey's work. We get collectivity synchronically. So we have students coming together at the same time. It's more than one student being taught these repetitive practices, and the interactions between the students is significant in different moments of the book. There's I was really fascinated by a moment actually in the first chapter, which wasn't circulated in Walter Pater's work, where Ramsey describes a scene in which you have older students, I think in a boarding school, are testing and correcting the younger students as they try to memorize Horace. And that kind of collectivity, which is not cross-generational because they're all students. It reminds me of what people say today as like a learning community. People talk about that in educational jargon. But I'm interested in thinking more about that and the way that the old school methods harness collectivity, and how that is distinct from what's happening or what's happening in a lot of progressive methods, which, with their emphasis on the new, often put a very strong emphasis on individualism, have a hard time trying to think collectivity. Not all progressive methods, but a lot do. So that's one dimension of collectivity. A second I wanted to mention is another dimension of collectivity was a collectivity across time. So the first is synchronic. This one isn't exactly diachronic though, because we're not talking about a linear temporality at all, even though there is something happening across history or transhistorically, however way to understand that trans. I think this idea has something to do with the very old idea of conversing with the greats when we study the classics, but it's a little different in the sense that the students are memorizing the greats' words, and I'm not sure if this conversation is really the right way to describe that. But here, this is obviously tied up with time, and just another invitation to try to think about in the kinds, and I think this is really at the heart of the book, given that Ramsey's working with 20th century texts and films and late 19th century retrievals of the past, what is going on with temporality and collectivity in those intersections. So another invitation to say more if he wishes. So that's the sort of second cluster of ideas. The third I'd like to focus on briefly is memorization and translation. I think they go together. This is, as we heard also in the introduction, but we get it reading the book. I mean, this is sort of one central feature of these old school methods, and this is the target of the progressive methods. This is often held up as the kind of everything that's wrong with traditional education is this dead repetition, just perfect repetition of the past, this kind of unthinking repetition. However, I mean, to achieve perfect repetition is really, really hard. And it's the end of a very long process if we ever get there at all, because memorization is a process. It's not a product. It's something we do, and it's something that involves more failure than success. So the idea of perfect repetition is kind of an ideal. It's certainly an ideal. And I'm interested in having Ramsey say a bit more, since he's spent so much time thinking through some of these methods and these attempts to kind of valorize the methods, of what kind of transformative potential is there in that the trial and error and error with the error more than success in memorization. And it's also important to always remember that for the students, when they're memorizing these old texts, these texts are new. Sort of felt like saying this to you, Ramsey, when you want to repudiate your book. It's like, no, it's old for you, but it's very new for us. So, or it's very new for me to read. And that's something always important to keep in mind. Sometimes the progressive critique assumes that the sort of the inheritance is passed on automatically, that everyone has the inheritance of the past. And I think to actually do that requires a lot of work. Anyway, that's just to say a little bit more about memorization, perhaps, or as a process and the power of that. And then related to that is translation. And I think this is a really interesting and important dimension of it too, is that in a lot of these methods, I take it, it's not that students are actually asked to repeat Latin without understanding. They're supposed to do it with understanding. But that process of understanding, I take it, takes place through translation, through translating the words into one's own tongue. And you were touching on this, or more than touching on it, in the beautiful quotation you gave, Ramsey, at the beginning. So I guess there's something to think about there as well, is that, again, the progressive critique doesn't really care about translation, and which effectively just ignores translation altogether, because it assumes that perfect translation is possible, so it's irrelevant. But against that, I would just put on the table the idea of untranslatables, and be thinking about the untranslatable remainder that's always there, that always blocks perfect translation as a part of the old school methods. And if I can follow up with one other question related to this, I was thinking when I was reading the book, it's such a rich work of scholarship, and so much work went into it, and so much translation work went into it. I think seems to me, by Ramsey himself. And I was wondering if that affected you when you were reading, well, I'm sure it affected you, if that affected your theory and your argument, sort of the education through translation that you yourself gained to produce this book, whether that relates to the argument that the book made. So I'd really be super interested to hear about that. Two more things, so I'm almost there. I wanted to put the spotlight somewhere slightly differently on the visual, and this is now to move to chapter 5, the chapter focused on Hosche's Claro, and I think it would apply to chapter 4 as well, on Salo. So one of the really interesting and exciting claims of the book, and runs right through the book, is that all of the texts and films studied by Ramsey and analysed, they don't only promote old school methods, but they enact them in different ways. And we see this in the last chapter with Hosche's film. And here Ramsey argues that the film, that watching the film, we're subjected to obstacles to understanding and insight, and to the repetitive elements of traditional schooling and some of the rhetoric of some of the speeches in the film and voiceovers. And as Ramsey has actually said in the introduction, this in itself, this exposure has a transformative potential, because in part because we get to see how oppressive or repressive these methods are, and how difficult it is to be confronted with obscurity, which sort of pushes us to seek an alternative. And this would be in contrast to the progressive methods. So Ramsey argues in the introduction, and we get the argument throughout the book. I have a quote here, but I'm missing it. So I'll just paraphrase what I'm trying to say, is that there is an idea here that the progressive methods hide the fact that the oppression is still in place and the constraints are still in place. They act as if freedom is easy. Now, the contrast in chapter 5 is drawn between Hosche on the one hand and Paulo Freire, as Ramsey said, on the other. And here I would just a bit and suggest that maybe they're not so opposed, or that one could bring them together. And one way into that could be to think about the way that for Freire, even though he is very committed to clarity and very committed to presenting reality, or for students to be confronted by the reality that is there, he does it when he's teaching literacy to adults through an emphasis on, or through a use of the visual. So the method used visual, not stimulus, but visual objects of study in order to teach literacy. And that made me think maybe the way that Ramsey is reading Claro, together within his reading, Ramsey is sort of imparting in us as potential viewers of Claro, if we go to watch the film after reading the chapter, with a kind of a critical awareness of what's going on in the film. To me, that sounds a lot like the kind of thing Freire is after, even if Freire himself doesn't quite do it. But it seems very Freirean. So I'll just put that on the table as a possibility. A broader point here, this is a different question, but related. Sorry, 1,000 questions, like 12 questions I'm asking, is just one really nice move in the book is the move from the textual and the oral to the visual and to cinema towards the end in the last 2 chapters, even though those chapters in 2 involve a lot of engagement with written text as well by the directors. But I wonder, I'd like to just hear more if there's a shift in the method that takes place when we move to film, the methods that Ramsey's diagnosing, the old school methods. Lastly, I'll wrap up with a final idea, and this is sort of fundamental to the whole book, is just the idea of progress. And this is kind of flagged a little bit if I'm trying to bring Hosche and Freire together. Now Ramsey's careful here and very intelligent about it. He describes the old school methods as counter-progressive, not anti-progressive. So it's not a clear opposition. But part of the argument seems to me to be, and I sort of encapsulate it when talking about the Hosche chapter, seems to be the following. It's that because the progressive methods are obscuring the reality, they pretend that freedom is easy when in fact we're not free. At least the old school methods have the advantage of bringing us that knowledge. Things like that can actually help us break free of the constraint. Put that way, it seems to me that the ultimate value is progress. And the claim is that the old school methods are actually better at achieving progress than the progressive methods. I think that is one of the arguments of the book. I think it's a very powerful argument. It's easy to state it like that, but I think it's hard to argue it. And I think Ramsey does a really good job of arguing for it. But I just close by suggesting, I think there's other, and Ramsey touched on this in his opening remarks again, there are other values to the old school methods than just progress. And so maybe I had my eye too much on progress because it's something I'm wrestling with in my own work, because I think progress is very hard to escape, even when one tries to. But I'd really like to hear more from Ramsey about the way that progress is not the only value at work in these methods, and how we're to kind of think of other values in them. But that's a lot, but that's just, as I said, that's a reflection that there's a lot in the book. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Sam. We'll next hear from Anne Rogerson. So Dr. Anne Rogerson from the Department of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Sydney teaches and researches in Latin literature and culture and its reception, especially pertaining to Virgil's epic, the Aeneid. She's the author of many articles, but her book, Virgil's Ascanius, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. And as someone here who has a lot of experience actually teaching Latin, it's nice to have her perspective. And please join me in welcoming Anne.
Thanks, Tristan, and thanks to you and to Ben for the invitation to speak at this event, and particularly to Ramsey for Old Schools, which I've been reading with lots of pauses over the past couple of months, and which has given me a great deal of food for thought. Now, as Tristan said, I am a teacher of Latin language and literature, so I have kind of a stake, one might say, in questions about the benefits or otherwise accruing from the undeniable labor of learning Latin. I was tasked specifically with responding to chapter 2, which is the one on the Italian poet Giovanni Pascali, and which has at its heart a Neo-Latin poem called Pedagogium. So I'm going to share some slides because I'll be talking quite a lot about the poem. I want to give you something to hang on to. So let's see, there we go. So Pedagogium, it was the winning entry in 1904 in an annual poetry competition, which was organized by the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, a competition which has been described as undoubtedly the most important Latin poetry contest of the 19th and 20th century. So there's fame. The poem then it's the fruit of significant Latin learning, and its context, one of its contexts, is this international competition in which Latin, long after its putative death, flourished as a lingua franca among a highly educated elite. So the poem's staging of the difficulties of learning classical languages and the ever-present possibility of error, of getting things wrong, is all the more, I think, piquant in that context. And the international stage on which the poem competed inspires my first question for Old Schools, which has to do with the national and the international in modernist discussions of education, or maybe with the relationship between nationalism and internationalism. As Ramsey's book very clearly demonstrates that Pascali's poem is situated and implicated within a particular Italian context in which the efficacy of Latin learning in building a unified Italian nation is a hot topic. So the poem speaks in and speaks to those debates very clearly, but also reaches out aspirationally beyond the borders of Italy. So I was wondering how does, or indeed does, the fact that the poem was written for and triumphed in an international competition nuance its interventions in national Italian arguments about the deadening or the enlivening, the unifying or the divisive effects of Latin at home, as it were. Now, this question, which I guess relates to brotherhood among nations, is indeed raised up front in the poem, which is a 187-line long treat. I'm so grateful to Ramsey for bringing it to my attention because I enjoyed it enormously. The poem is about a group of hostage princes from across the Roman Empire gathered together at a school on the Palatine during the reign of Septimius Severus, while he's away battling the Picts. The boys play and they quarrel. So I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but Spaniard throws a ball, an Arab catches it, African builds a tower, Briton knocks it down, and then an extended simile likens them to a diverse group of birds, all different colors, all sheltering together from a sudden rain shower, and then coming out to play and sing. And we've got sparrows and larks and finches and so on, all together in this kind of mixed up flock. Okay, so that's a brief description of the early lines of the poem. And as that suggests, the poem is broadly interested in the ties that bind. So what brings people together is one of the questions that Pascali asks. Christian faith emerges as one of those things, but another is the shared experience of the ritual humiliations of a traditional Latin or Greek classroom, because as well as playing games, these little hostage princes brought in from across the empire are being acculturated, and they learn Latin and Greek too, with greater or lesser enthusiasm and aptitude. And their lessons are presided over by the sort of teacher so memorably reflected in John Cleese's Centurion in the Life of Brian. And in the Pedagogium, the pupils talk about him quite a lot and characterize him as frequently kind of ulcerously indignant in the face of linguistic slips. He's a torturer, and he's also a pedantic critic, right? Constantly on the hunt for his pupils' mistakes. Now, there are two boy characters whose views on the teacher I've put up on the slide there. Alexamenos, who is Greek-speaking and from somewhere in the Far East, and Chaereas, a Gaul. They're the protagonists of the poem. Alexamenos is studious, Chaereas less so, one might say, and the plot kind of revolves around an invitation to play that's extended by Chaereas and rebuffed by Alexamenos, who prefers to memorize Virgil. And then his refusal leads to kind of blows before the teacher intervenes and locks Chaereas in detention, where he too rages before he scratches a graffito on the wall, along with an inscription. And there you get to the kind of inspiration for the poem, because like several of Pascali's Neo-Latin poems, Pedagogium is inspired by a kind of real material survival from the classical past. The graffito that Chaereas scrawls in secret in the poem, in which he declares, won't be found wanting in its expression by the pedantic critic, has a real life historical counterpart, and it is the so-called Alexamenos graffito, which was discovered on the wall of a room of a building near the Palatine, and it depicts a crucified man with the head of a donkey being worshipped by another figure to the left. It's accompanied by crudely inscribed Greek, which I've transcribed there. Alexamenos sebete theon. This is the inscription which Chaereas thought would be safe from the critical eye of his teacher. Any errors it might contain, never to be hunted down by that pedantic critic, the pedagogical pedant. His decision to write it in Greek, which is not his first language, is explained in the poem too, because his target, Alexamenos, the studious boy who wouldn't play with him, vengefully outed here as a Christian, is Greek-speaking. So I'll use Greek words and letters because I'm attacking a Graikos. Now you can see for yourselves that Chaereas's lettering is not very neat. He's made a mistake in the Greek too, as those of you who read ancient Greek will realize. His teacher surely would have spotted this, as to, I think, Pascali's erudite audience on the judging panel. Sebete, the verb, it's a second person plural form. The subject, Alexamenos, is singular. Alexamenos, they worship, so imagine John Cleese, right? I'm not going to do the voices, but holding Chaereas by the ear, relentlessly pinning him down, extracting with painful ferocity exactly what's wrong with this Greek and getting him to fix it. Not sebete, but sebetai. What he's trying to say is Alexamenos worships God. Right, so don't do that again. More forgiving readers than the teacher in the poem, whose response I've just kind of imagined, have suggested that this is actually a phonetic misspelling rather than an egregious kind of Brian-like error. But the mistake slipped out all the same. Unsurprisingly, in the context of the poem, given the way that Pascali has had Chaereas speak already several times about how bad his Greek is. And of course, you'll notice that the poem here hints at the presence of error and its need for correction. Okay, so I've myself somewhat painstakingly, probably pedantically, explained the joke here, even though I'm aware of the deadening effect of doing that, in order to highlight the way that this poem revels in people getting it wrong and the playful possibilities that that opens up. And I think the critical or teacherly position that kind of maneuver invites us, its readers, to adopt. Which I guess is my second question for Ramsey, which is how implicated are the readers of the Paedagogium, and indeed of the other works discussed in old schools, in the meditations on progress and education, on learning and misunderstanding that they offer and invite us to join? And I'm speaking myself, I guess, as a teacher of Latin, which is a very peculiar position. And I asked myself, well, what do I, as an overeducated teacher, make of this sort of material? And what does our response or responses, what do our responses to it say about us, the inheritors both of progressive and traditional modes of education, particularly those of us who are still flogging the dead or alive linguistic team of Latin and Greek? So if you'll indulge me in one more slightly nerdy excursus, I want to show you that these questions too are implicitly asked in the Paedagogium. The passage I've got here is from the part of the poem before the going gets rough, as it were. Koreas is still trying to persuade Alexamenos to play ball. Alexamenos says, oh, well, I don't know how to play that game. And Koreas quotes a sapiens, right, in the second line I've got up there, a wise guy, a philosopher. Lusus magister optimus, play is the best teacher. But he's misquoting here, as Alexamenos is quick to point out. If I remember correctly, that's usus, experience is the best teacher. And of course, he's right, because the admonitory authority, the sapiens, is Cicero. Of course, it's Cicero, who else? Usus magister est optimus, pro Riberio 9:6. Footnote. Okay, so this I love this passage. There's so much going on just in these few lines. But what I'm centrally interested in for today is how funny this arch exchange is to the characters in the poem, right? They think it's hilarious what they've just done. They both laugh. And how that exchange and their enjoyment of it sets up classical learning and playing with classical learning as something that occasionally, at least, is hilarious. And something that through play can form bonds between two very different boys, one who speaks Greek, the other who doesn't, one from the East and one from the West, one who's studious, the other one who finds study a kind of a torment. So despite their different backgrounds and capabilities, pedantic Latin games give them a space, if only for a short while, to be friends and to laugh together before later in the poem, Christian faith forms even closer ties between two young boys very far away from their homes and their families. Okay, and the poem's turn towards Christianity inspires my final question, or maybe this is a suggestion. We've already seen, I've talked about how the midsection of the poem gives us a rift between two schoolmates. They fight, Koreas is put in detention, he scratches that bittered graffito attacking Alexamenos and revealing him as a Christian, which is a dangerous thing to do because Christians were still persecuted under Septimius Severus. Ramsey has a really nice close reading of the moment where immediately after inscribing the graffito, Koreas's anger is kind of flushed away. And that moment is what leaves him ready for reconciliation. The latter part of the poem has the two boys come together again, and Alexamenos converts his former tormentor, and they come together as brothers in Christ. At the very end, hand in hand, they leave the school to face a very uncertain future, almost certainly to be martyred at the hands of the Romans. The torments of the classroom, I guess, transferring into different sorts of real life torture outside. So it seems like from that description, is this a poem of two very different halves? But I think maybe not. So my third question has to do with the way that the torture of learning dead languages is related by Pascali to Alexamenos's worship of the crucified Christ. And I guess I've also suggested just now implicitly to his future martyrdom. So we've already seen Chaereas's declaration that their teacher is a torturer. And this is followed by an exchange between the two boys that I confess I didn't fully understand the first time I read it. So Chaereas says, the teacher's a torturer, Alexamenos, no, he's pious. And Chaereas doubles down. The teacher or the experience of being taught by him is a mala crux, a terrible torment. Alexamenos doesn't understand what he's talking about. Well, some people like torture, says Chaereas. Oh, really, says Alexamenos, in real or feigned ignorance. Okay, now the first time I read those lines, and this is coming from me as a Latin teacher, my mind went straight to the Roman comic stage. Mala crux is a Plautine phrase, almost a catchphrase. It's what in the plays of Plautus you see characters call creditors demanding pay, or you can call a mala crux might be a grievance that is driving you crazy, or an outcome that goes against you. Basically, a mala crux is something that you don't like in Plautus. So what I thought Chaereas was talking about was the fact that he finds language learning a torture, and Alexamenos is a swot, and so enjoys it. And even as Chaereas continues after this passage, accusing Alexamenos of going apart from the other boys all the time, muttering constantly to himself, I imagined that he was referring not to the rituals of Christian prayer, but to the repetitive recitation that's involved in memorizing Virgil, and which is the task that Alexamenos offered as a reason that he didn't want to play ball. But of course, a light bulb moment for me, in this poem, the metaphorical crux, the cross of Plautine comedy has another meaning, I guess a real one, a historical one, which offers the possibility of transcendence. The cross on which Christ is crucified, which comes fully into view as Chaereas scratches his graffito on the wall. The cross comes back at the end of the poem, as referred to by the teacher, who is aghast to discover that his star pupil is a closet Christian. And he asks Alexamenos to leave the cross to the bad guys, to the thieves and the runaway slaves crucified there. Alexamenos refuses to forswear his God and instead heads out with his new brother Chaereas. So dedication to the crux, the mala crux of language learning, transforms in the course of the poem towards dedication to the crux of the crucifixion. And the boy whose description as sanctus, as a holy child, initially seems to refer to his position as teacher's pet, star pupil, it emerges in the course of the poem, if not literally sainted, then soon to be so, right, post-martyrdom, which is where he's heading as he leaves. So as I read and reread, read and reread the Pythagorean, I was driven to wonder whether it hints at the possibility even of salvation or redemption somehow in or through the torture and the repetitive act that is learning Latin. The language may be dead. All language, as Pascali suggests, may be dying or dead, kind of killed off as it gets nailed to the page by the poet. But this prize-winning little poem seems to me to open up by its end the same kind of possibility that's also seen in Ramsey's examination of the works of Pater, for example, in chapter 1 of his amazing book, the possibility of seeing the learning of dead languages as a ritual performance that is not just a penance or a torture, but that perhaps surprisingly kind of allows us to bond not just through fellow suffering, but also in that suffering to kind of transcend, to live forever somehow. Okay, and that's the end of my flight of fancy, so I will stop at that point.
Thanks so much, Anna. That was wonderful. Let's give Ramsey a right of reply.
So I am one of those whom torment pleases. And that means it was really fun to work up some thoughts, to write out some thoughts in response to these comments. Both Sam and Anne were kind enough to send versions of the responses they just gave to me. So I had the chance to write out some replies. And I'm going to read them not in order to have this seem to you all rehearsed or rote. Happy to go off book as soon as I've delivered these comments, but but I worried that I would lose the thread given the complexity and richness of both responses, which I really am so grateful for. They're gifts, both of them. So I'd like to begin with Sam's questions about progress at the end of his response, since they get at what I see as some of the highest stakes questions raised in old schools. Progress. In the book, I thought of myself as dealing not with different means to the same end. So this was Sam's question, or a version of it, I think, right? Are these counter-progressive means to what's ultimately a progressive end, so that progress sneaks in through the back door or wins the day? What I saw these experiments as was instead experiments that involved ends meaningfully different from those of progress. So incidentally, this is why at the very end of the book, I quote Deleuze on what needs to happen in order for the problem to change. So those last pages in the book, I think, might strike some readers as strange because of how Deleuze, who's been nowhere throughout, suddenly descends like a deus ex machina, right? But I really do find that formulation valuable. In order for the problem to change, his phrase, right, means that the shift is meaningful and material, not just a matter of different solutions, but of different problems, which is to say different historical projects. So in the book, I'm asking whether what I call old schools can maybe put us in touch with these projects, these different historical projects, in ways that progressive education can't, because of how it's bound up with or integral to and inescapable from liberal modernity. So to be clear, I'm not saying we can do without struggles for better, more just, more democratic institutions and society. So if that's what we mean by progressive, then so be it. But even though all of my authors see themselves as involved in these struggles, and it's important that I'm not writing about reactionary calls for us to return to or revive the traditions of old schools, I don't think this means that I'm calling for progress or like reverting to an understanding of progress in the end, or that all visions for alternatives to the present are necessarily progressive. And maybe, Sam, this wasn't what you were suggesting, but just to reply as pointedly as I can, right? Especially as my chapters proceed and they track a process of radicalization as they go, so that Rocha's vision's meaningfully more challenging and radical than, say, Pascali's, right? His political vision or his vision of an alternative. As the chapters proceed, they take distance from liberal and progressive notions that, in my account, are inseparable from progress. Well, forgive I was writing at speed, right? So liberal notions that are inseparable from progress, which is not the ultimate value in my book, because in my author's terms, it's bound up with liberal modernity. I'm repeating myself, but by the end of the book with Eurocentrism as well. So it's too much a matter of history written by the victors in Benjamin's terms, the notion of progress. And so we need another vocabulary in order to name what my authors are after. This is why I go in search of various vocabularies, right? So the language of revolution, if we're reading Marx, or redemption, or more modestly interruption, if we're reading Benjamin, or proletarian hegemony, if we're reading Gramsci, or if we're reading Fanon, like Rocha is, then invention, right? The language of invention. In my account, we can't and shouldn't assume that all of these values are reducible to progress or translatable into progressive terms. And I'll come back to the question of translation later. So in this sense, decolonial theory, though no one brought this up formally in the responses, I do want to say that it's interesting and even indispensable in my view, because it's about changing the problem precisely, right? Finding real alternatives to progress, as it has been and continues to be Eurocentrically defined, an effort that can also be found, of course, in Freire's work. Where I push back against some versions of decolonial thought, though, is in my interest in Rocha's insistence that Rome cannot simply be bypassed. Rome, right, and everything it represents cannot simply be bypassed, that we cannot avoid a confrontation or dialectical engagement with empire and its legacies. There's value in learning these even laboriously, not only because they're what we're up against, so in Sam's terms, I think reality, right? But also because this process, the learning process, puts us in touch with our critical capacities in something like the way Freire has in mind in his account of education for critical consciousness. Thank you, Sam, for sending me back to this text. There are a few block quotations from it in the PowerPoint presentation that I have sent out to you all, brief and fairly straightforward. So yes, Sam, there is a way. I think that Rocha and Freire can be brought together, but what interests me is that in Rocha and not in Freire, the stress falls on the moment of estrangement or alienation or blockage, right? The hindrance to progress, what impedes dialogue. Freire thinks that what he calls anti-dialogue is and can only be acritical. I'm quoting, "It lacks love, is therefore acritical and cannot create a critical attitude," end quote. It stifles imagination and stunts students' intellectual and political capacities. This is where I think Rocha differs from Freire, right? Rocha's interest is in the way in which anti-dialogue, or the teacher's wordiness and worse, can give rise to, even be conducive to, critique. By the way, I take the word wordiness from Freire himself, or rather from his translator. It's adjectival in the Portuguese, so ostensivamente palavresca, ostentatiously or excessively wordy. In Education for Critical Consciousness, or Education as the Practice of Freedom from 1967, Freire says he wants to rid our education of its wordiness so that the figure of the bad teacher in Freire comes to resemble the rote teacher. This is flashback to chapter 1, the rote teacher who, according to the English school inspector I quote in my chapter on Pater, gives students nothing but words. It is difficult to love such a teacher, I'm quoting. The inspector continues, because it is not obvious what good he communicates, end quote. So too is Clado a film that's difficult to love deliberately. And it struck me that rather than either staging or inviting dialogue, the film seeks to use anti-dialogue against itself, so that when Freire says in Education for Critical Consciousness, to quote just one last time, our traditional curriculum, disconnected from life, centered on words, emptied of the reality they're meant to represent, could never develop a critical consciousness. I think he's foreclosing a possibility that Rocha wants to explore and to reopen. Quote from Freire, the Brazilian tradition has not been to exchange ideas, but to dictate them, not to debate or discuss themes, but to give lectures, not to work with the student, but to work on him, imposing an order to which he has had to accommodate. So that's Freire. For his part, Rocha makes a film that works on us, like very, very programmatically works on us, and makes us stop to think about how imposition can lead to something other than accommodation, how it can lead to what in the chapter I call non sequitur, which is to say a moment of rebellion, rupture, and discontinuity, or in Sam's really helpful terms, a break in the diachronic. That can also be a moment of creative translation, as when the character played by Julia Berto gives a speech that swerves away from, even while it responds to, the lectures that she's been listening to throughout the film. So here translation's pointedly not about repeating the same, as Sam says, it's about the emergence of something else that's somehow been made possible by, it's not just emerging despite, right, the rote ritual exercises that lead up to this point in Clado. Now, to pivot to Anne's incredibly generous and generative reading of Pascali, although this will itself seem like a non sequitur, I want to be clear that the two figures, so in case someone's left wondering, I don't know who you're here for. Maybe you came for Pascali and stayed for Rocha, or vice versa. But in any case, I just want to make it clear that I'm not saying in the book that they share, these two figures, a set of sensibilities, right? I'm not suggesting that they can be lumped together any more than I'm lumping together fascist educational philosophy on the one hand and Paulo Freire on the other, right? So I'm making distinctions. One thing I mean when I say the book traces a process of radicalization is that it moves leftward in a movement that's also in the end one out of schoolrooms and into Roman streets. That was important to me as I was completing the final chapter. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, another non sequitur, about Sinead O'Connor's recently published memoir. And the podcast host said this thing that stayed with me, which is that Sinead O'Connor divides people into two categories. So that everyone she encounters in her life is either punk, as in punk rock, or square. And so just to say, although I love Pascali, I really think it must be said that whereas Rocha's punk, Pascali's square. I appreciate this about him and even feel profoundly identified, though I suppose the book tries to have it both ways by moving from him to the more openly rebellious less pious figures at the center of later chapters, as if to say, I contain multitudes, both squares and punks, as if I myself am saying, right, that I contain both squares and punks and squares. So I'm riffing in this way, not in order to dodge Anne's questions, which I really appreciate. Instead, I'm trying to begin to answer her questions, which start from a place of, or lay out, right, the problem of identification, of who we are or think we are when we read, and how that affects how we read. So this problem recurs in her remarks. And in my chapter on Pascali, I'm committed, maybe Anne prompts me to think overcommitted, to the claim that Pascali's poem interpolates us as pupils, just as Claudio puts us in the position of the rote teacher's students. But Anne wonders, what if the poem also asks us to read as teachers, right? Also puts us in that position, or even primarily puts us in that position. What if it interpolates us as correcting, not only corrected, testing and not only tested? I can say more about how, like the circumstances under which I belatedly returned to Latin after a long hiatus, but suffice it to say for now, though this will surprise no one, that I was reading Pascali as a student of Latin, right? Not a teacher of the language. And by bringing a different kind of attention and erudition to bear on Pascali's text, Anne makes me wonder how much of my reading was colored by that fact, right? By the fact of my relationship to the Latin language, informed by my status as something other than a classicist, someone not even moonlighting as a legit Latinist. So the punishing preceptor that is my superego suggests that I should have undergone several more ordeals, gone through many more rounds of humiliating rituals in my own Latin study. But again, in all seriousness, I'm really grateful to take part in a conversation where Anne's reading and mine can coexist, where we can engage in dialogue and not anti-dialogue. So that's proof, just another concession, right? Proof, if more were needed, that Freire's teaching style is not one that I'm suggesting we can simply do without, right? I too need dialogue. But to sum up with some pithier answers to Anne's questions very quickly, I know we want to open it up for some more open-ended conversation. To sum up, I do think that its status as something other than a national language is a major part of what drives Pascali to write in Latin. This is one implication of the contrast that I set up between him and Giovanni Gentile, a fascist educational philosopher, Minister of Education under Mussolini, right, who subsumes Latin into Italian, ancient into modern. On the question of transcendence at the end of Pascali's poem, to come to the end of my own remarks, Anne offers a really persuasive reading of the Mala Crux as at once linguistic torment and crucifixion, at once scholastic difficulty and source of salvation. In my reading of the chapter, there's what I call a reach for the transcendent that's complicated and maybe even countered or thwarted by the poem's status. It's knowing itself to be homework, right? And Anne's reading suggests that it's homework that we're not only assigned to complete, but also asked to mark, like in fantasy, right? To correct, to do or to mark homework in my reading, right? To commit lines to memory or correct students' grammatical errors in recitations is to do something other than transcend the present, except when it's not, is I think Anne's suggestion. And so it's a question maybe of emphasis in our two readings. Again, I'd like to think that the two readings can coexist and even speak to one another. To begin this conversation would also be to come back full circle to Sam's question about the meaning of school in my book. Is it disciplining and restrictive in Sam's words, or is it not? Or rather, to paraphrase his question one more time, why is it that in old schools are sometimes disciplining and restrictive and sometimes not? What Anne's concluding comments capture that I see as very much in keeping with my argument in the book is that there are times when the meaning of school, one meaning of school opens onto another, and the school can operate in several contradictory ways at once, right? Mean several things simultaneously. A square takes a punk by the hand and they leave. Imposed chores turn out to be practice for other collective tasks, preparation for what doesn't follow. Thank you.
Many thanks. Let's throw it to the audience. So if you have a question, let me know in the chat. So you type a Q and I'll call on you, or you can type your question and I'll read it. Either works. Are there any questions ready to go? James Lay. You're on mute still, James. making my error. It's infectious.
Thanks, Tristan. That's better. Yeah. I really enjoyed all of those thoughts about the book. My thoughts about the book were in relation to the coincidence of progressive pedagogy at a time of fascist government. And I think there's some material from Gramsci early in the book about how can it be that you have progressive pedagogy working at the same time that you've got a fascist regime. And for me, this brings to mind Plato's Republic, in which we find the first description of a progressive pedagogy, but also the outline for a strongly authoritarian regime, a fascist regime, an aesthetically austere regime. In Plato's case, the progressive pedagogy is one with lots of learner activity, exactly the kind of learner activity that we've come to value in progressive pedagogy in the 20th century, where learners are interacting, listening, and responding rather than passively having a curriculum beaten into them. And Plato thought that the guardians of the Republic were to abandon habituation at the earliest time in their education and thereafter pursue this dialectic education by short turns in question and answer in all subjects. But at the same time that he puts forward this progressive pedagogy for the most important people in his republic, as he sees it, he's also outlining a strongly restrictive fascist regime. Why is that for Plato? For Plato, it seems to be that he wants to reject the legacy of Homer and the pedagogy in which Homer is most of the content of Greek education. So thinking about the coincidence of progressive pedagogy and a fascist regime in the 20th century, my question is to ask whether it's an attempt, it occurs at a time and in a society that's trying to distance itself from some legacy of the past, some cultural legacy of the past, and might be something, a historical feature that we could expect to see in societies that are trying to innovate and set a distance with a cultural legacy. I hope that's a good enough question. Thanks, Tristan.
Ramsey.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm happy to answer briefly and appreciate the backstory. Always good to discover how much further back the history of these debates extends, or to be reminded. So thank you, I appreciate that. I think what's so interesting about the Italian fascist and proto-fascist moment is that they're simultaneously wanting to achieve distance from a burdening, deadening, stifling cultural legacy, and wanting to appropriate that legacy to imperial ends, right? For the sake of pursuing imperial projects, right? So it's, you know, it leads people like Giovanni Gentile, this educational philosopher, whom Gramsci will then argue against quite, you know, quite forcefully. It leads people like this to need to do some interesting sorts of gymnastics, like mental gymnastics, in order to be able to both draw on the kind of Northern European tradition of thinking about student-centered, what we now call student-centered or highly individuated, modern, prototypically modern forms of education, right? But at the same time, he's having to also say, well, we're not going to leave Latin behind. Hence the effort to say, oh, we are, right? We were and always will be, right? The Romans. But to be saying that at the same time as you're trying to draw inspiration from Rousseau is difficult to pull off, and not surprisingly impossible, right? I mean, just not, these aren't good or sound arguments that he ends up making, but I do think they're very instructive arguments, a word I admittedly overuse in the book, right? But I think it's really interesting to revisit this moment of kind of ideological complexity, overlap, and counterintuitive borrowing and other kinds of complexity. So I would say yes to your question, but also it's complicated by the fascist and proto-fascist effort to claim, right, to appropriate and identify with the legacy of Rome.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for now? While I have the opportunity, I'll quickly ask, Ramsey, I'm not sure if you teach language in your position or in your prior positions, but I'm curious how these reflections on pedagogy impact your own teaching, maybe especially beyond language learning and language instruction. How does it inform your teaching of literature, the effort to inculcate critical thinking and the kind of, a contradiction that sounds like, right? To inculcate critical thinking. Yeah.
I mean, I wish I could say that I took inspiration from the drag queen played by Carmelo Bene in Rocha's Claro, this guy, this kind of dramaturg in drag who just like holds forth and expects people to discover their critical capacities in that moment in these crazy spaces in ways that are both. No, I mean, I'm joking. No, so I was teaching some language in my position at St. Andrews that won't currently be in the new job. But I have thought about this a lot, right? What it meant to be writing a book that was about a pedagogy that couldn't strictly be implemented under contemporary conditions, right? For all kinds of reasons. And so I guess if I could open a parenthesis to just clarify that it's not that I'm endorsing the techniques I write about just with a straight face, right? Or full stop. It's that I suppose endorsing the endorsements, right? Like the saying that there's a tradition or counter tradition, a tendency to revisit these educational theories and practices that is itself worth learning from today. That moment of mediation, right, is important, so that I always want to be sure that I'm not heard as simply saying like, only lecture at your students, don't engage them in dialogue, or only have them memorize poems, please, or translate them painstakingly in the most punishing possible fashion. Don't involve them, don't be engaging and interesting, don't meet them where they are. All these, things that I'm not suggesting are, I'm not suggesting aren't good, right? I'm not suggesting we shouldn't learn from that other progressive tradition also, or that we could get away with, or that one would even want to, right? Throw all that away. So close parenthesis, and to come back to the way in which it does show up, though, I think maybe improbably or just provisionally in a kind of like as a counterplot in any given class, or in a series of like moments that are brief and don't consume the student's attention throughout the term. But I believe that creating space for repeated readings of lyric poems, for example, right, just creating space in the classroom for us to not just one time but 6 times hear the poem that is before us, so that as Sam was saying, right, like the students can then begin to appreciate that each time the poem is read, though it's the same poem, it's also not the same poem. I believe that this is still possible, and that students, I mean, I've found, anecdotally, I've found that they tend to be into this. So that's just one example of the ways in which I think they're small elements of this pedagogy that can be drawn on, though I really don't want the book to be read as a full-throated endorsement of cruel teacherly techniques or bad education as such.
It's interesting, if I can respond to that. I'm surprised in a way that you want to distance yourself from it quite that far, because I think one of the things that I was impressed by and which was impressed upon me when I was reading the introduction was that there is an enormous generativity to finding something you want to oppose. And it's funny, every so often this comment comes back to me that someone made to me once, which was, "Oh, Tristan, what do you think about that idea?" And I apologized and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go on a rant here," because it was something which really fired me up. And he said, "No, that's my favorite, Tristan." And that comes back to me every so often because I realize I think I'm actually a pretty boring person. But if you get me on a topic which I'm really passionate about, then it seems like I have some capacity to engage people. And there is something there I recognize about myself that a lot of the time I feel pretty grey and lukewarm about things. But then when I find something which I really don't like, that's when I'm most enabled, and that's when I'm really able to do something, like in a really basic kind of sense. And so I wonder whether it's possible for us to see ourselves in the classroom as provokers. We're people who want to provoke reaction, because we all know as educators that the worst thing is to be met with a room full of, dull faces that just don't care. And so is it a serious strategic, move to actually be annoying, to create a conditions for the students to refuse you, and therefore generate the kind of engagement or an engagement even?
That so I was on the job market for these years, and so didn't feel I could get away with these kinds of pedagogical experiments of the kind you're describing, right? But you're making me think that it would be interesting as I accrue experience and become just more comfortable or just more senior in the classroom, right? To be more cadaverous, right? Like that Latin teacher in the Browning version. Might be an interesting thing to experiment with. I really appreciate that suggestion. And I'm very glad that you sort of just connected with the claims about what we come up against and how enabling that encounter can be, however frustrating, however, inhibiting or blocking, thwarting of us and our desires, right? That can actually be a place where interest is generated and energy, right? That's something pedagogical could reside there for that reason. I appreciate it.
And it goes deep. Sorry, I'm just going to indulge this opportunity. It goes deep. We had Matthew Sharp present in this workshop a few months ago, and he was talking about the text Homodimus by Lucian, and it's a real parody of the Socratic dialogue, and in some respects, what is at its heart is the question: how do you choose a way of life before you know what the good life to choose is? How can you ever make that leap and that move? And as I read the text and as I was listening to Matthew, I said, it sounds like there is a democratic potential that he wanted to kind of excavate out of these texts and these questions. But I said, in some respects, it seems like what Socrates and Socratic philosophy itself teaches, and in some respects you can't overcome, is that in order to find the wisdom that you have to find people who don't have that wisdom, and which therefore reflects upon you what you might be able to claim for yourself. So with Socrates, being told that he was the wisest person in the world presses him to go and find people who are wiser. And it's only when he realizes that they don't know what they're talking about that he feels like he is able to claim some kind of wisdom, which is, I'm the only person that realizes I don't really know anything. And so in the end, there might just be this kind of deep, irreducible relationship between claims to knowledge and finding something which you don't want to avow, or what you want to disavow. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, by the way. Well, Sam, Sam has put the comment, wait until you get tenure to Ramsey, which I was also thinking. And it does actually prompt me to want to ask Sam, okay, Sam, well then how do you teach now that you have tenure? But we are out of time. Ramsey does have another thing to get to. So thanks so much, Ramsey, for sharing this time with us. Thanks so much for sharing your book with us. It's been really wonderful to have this as another added dimension to what we're trying to do with the Critical Antiquities Network.
Thanks a million. It's been really and truly a pleasure. And I'm sorry I didn't get to, speak to more of you in a dialogic way, but I hope people will be in touch if that's something that would be interesting to anyone. And yeah, just thanks again. It's really been fun.
And I really want to thank Sam and Anne for the time and the care that they've taken in preparing their responses. It's just wonderful, and it makes the workshop just so much richer for their different areas of expertise and wisdom. So thank you. And we'll see you again next time.